David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The taxation bright line test for residential land bill is third reading is a bill that sponsored by the Minister Todd McClay, and we wish to acknowledge Todd and the work he's done in this area, and especially around tax, and also that's part of a program of looking at the wider housing market in Auckland, and one of those initiatives to look at that market. When we look at it, it's important to look at the fundamental principles of tax law that underpin this area, and that last speaker ignored those in his speech. The fundamental principle is that if you sell a property within 10 years, that property is taxable if the intention was to buy or sell within that period of time. And so when we hear the opposition, they're always going to say the word speculator. And they'll say speculators are exempt from this, they're not getting caught by this legislation. That is rubbish. That is absolute rubbish. The fact is that if someone is a speculator, then they are in the business by definition of buying or selling the property. If they're in the business of buying or selling the property, it is taxable under New Zealand law. And if it is sold within the 10 years, then they have to explain that. And this bill, all this bill does is say that within the 2-year period, then you're deemed to be basically selling and buying as a speculator would, or as a property developer would, and so that is taxable. Now, the opposition is supporting this bill, which is a bit weird if they have so much problem with it. You'd wonder why they're actually supporting it. But I think that there is some big difficulties in the opposition. The first of all is that they had a program of a capital gains tax, and that capital gains tax policy failed at the last election. And I know, Mr Speaker, you're talking about this, and this is a taxation on the sale of property, and the capital gains tax is exactly the same as that. And the members opposite in their last weekend conference have put that to bed. They've said that they're not going to have a capital gains tax, and that's fine. They've obviously changed their tune. But before that, we heard from the opposition. I think the Green Party still hold to a capital gains tax, but the Labor Party doesn't. The Green Party agreed with the capital gains tax, but Labor Party has put that to bed. But the Labor Party also talk about a 5-year rule, that they would be comfortable with a 5-year rule. Well, what's the difference between a 2-year and a 5-year rule? They are 5 years, 1 day, same problem. Exactly the same thing. Same problem. And the member over there says, do the maths. Well, the thing is, that member ignores the fundamental principle of tax law, which we talked about, that if the intention is buying or selling, it's within 10 years. It doesn't matter if it's 2, 5 or 7. Within the 10 years, if the intention is buying or selling, then it is taxable. And so that is the thing. The 10-year rule is the preeminent rule. This is a subset of that rule. The intention. Well, then why do you're supporting it, which is good to see, and it's good to see.
Order. The member's not asking me at all. Yeah.
No, exactly. The member should stick to standing orders and not try and breach this.
The member will now resume his seat. I was trying to help the member stop the unhelpful interjections. And the member knows that when the Speaker makes a ruling, even from his seat, he's not meant to refer to it. David Bennett.
Mr Speaker, so this bill is actually really important, and the Labor Party is supporting it, which is great to see. But when they talk about a 5-year test, that makes no difference, because the 10-year rule is the preeminent rule, and it is the main test in this area of tax law. And the 2-year rule is really deeming transactions within that period of time to be considered taxable under the legislation, under tax legislation. So, Mr Speaker, when we look at the connection test, well, that will be something that will be defined through the interpretation of that, and it is not something that you would want, the legislation would want to define in the sense, because it is something that needs to take into account different circumstances and different factual situations that may arise, and that is common in tax law. That is why we have tax definitions suggestions and help through the Tax Department and their recommendations of what would be considered in and out of such a test, and also it's something that gives a bit of flexibility over time to look at different circumstances that may arise, and the IRD usually gives examples, and they will do so as they provide more information in the cases like this, so that taxpayers are fully aware of what the situation is. So, Mr. Speaker, the connection test is as would be normally expected in any tax law. It would not be expected to be defined to the extent that the last speaker asked for. If it was defined to that extent, then that would actually create the opportunity for people to get around that definition, because they would look at just getting around that part, and they need to have that flexibility within how that application of that test would be. This is an important piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker. The Labor Party is opposing it in principle, but then voting for it in practice, and it shows their conflict when it comes to this area. They do not have a consistent approach, and we've seen that in regard to capital gains taxes. We're seeing that again in regard to this House, in this House this afternoon. And Mr. Speaker, this is a piece of legislation that will have an important effect in the Auckland housing market, as other pieces of legislation that were connected with this bill have shown to have had an effect. And if we look at the last month's property price information from Auckland, we can see that stabilising, and that's after the implementation of the last piece of legislation which connected with this. So it's important that we support this bill, and we look forward to it going through the House, Mr. Speaker.